Welcome. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, Director of Shelter Solutions at Maddie's Fund. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. Today, we are joined by Dr. Erica Feuerbacher, an associate professor at Virginia Tech School of Animal Sciences. She is also the director of the Applied Animal Behavior and Welfare Lab there. Dr. Feuerbacher and her team investigated the behavioral and physiological effects of single or pair housing shelter dogs, most of which had recently entered the shelter, as well as the impact of pair housing on length of stay. In this talk, Dr. Feuerbacher will review the literature on cohousing dogs, go into detail on her study methods and results, and discuss the benefits and practical considerations of pair housing dogs. I'm super excited. Let's welcome Dr. Feuerbacher to learn more. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, so I see from your comments that a lot of you are in sheltering, which is fantastic. You're in the right spot. Just a little overview of sheltering in the United States, where we are currently. We have about 78 million dogs in the United States. That's our best estimate. More than 20% have been adopted from shelters, which is great. I think we have done as a community a really good job of promoting shelter dogs as excellent companions. Approximately 3.3 million dogs will enter a shelter in the United States each year. Again, best estimates. I think we're, again, doing better and better with some of these national consortiums to track data. Most of those are adopted or returned to the owner, which is great. We're doing much better there. The microchips and public outreach on that front is doing really well. Nevertheless, we still have about 14% being euthanized. So we always have room for improvement, and even those that stay with us and get adopted, we can always work to improve their lives. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, are some interventions, especially one intervention, cohousing, to improve that. So sheltering in the US has been changing. Our euthanasia rate has decreased from 2.6 million in 2011 to 1.5 million. This is probably a few years ago. And like I said before, we have fewer dogs entering the shelters, and the adoptions from the shelters is increasing, better return to owner. That means that shelters are able to house dogs longer because they're not, certainly shelters currently are overwhelmed, right? Especially after COVID, we've seen some weird fluctuations in these overall trends. But there's certainly a community expectation that we keep dogs and that we maintain them until they hopefully find their new adoptive home. And there's also a push to work with more medically and behaviorally challenging dogs, and a lot of our shelters are able to do that. Just some trends. This comes from the city of Los Angeles. And like Sheila said, we're thinking of all of the folks out there and what they're going through. So this graph just shows the trends in their data from around 1970, and this ends up in the late around 2018. But we can see the dog and cat intake, so this is both dogs and cats, in these triangles have been generally decreasing over years. The dog and cat euthanasia has also been decreasing, which is great. That might be a reflection just of fewer animals coming in. But I think what's interesting is around the mid-2000s, what we see is those lines diverge even more, that the euthanasia rate is decreasing even faster than the number of animals coming in, which suggests that I think we're, again, doing a better job of getting dogs back to their owner and getting dogs adopted and treating more medically and behaviorally challenging dogs. We do see, though, long lengths of stay for a number of dogs, and I think you can talk to a lot of shelters that have, average lengths of stay of a month or more, and certainly even within some of our fast turnover shelters, we can get some long stay dogs. That means that shelter welfare while they're with us is even more pertinent, that we want to keep their welfare overall, both their physical and their behavioral health, up to where it is, and maybe even improve it from when they came into our shelter. We know that shelters are stressful. Those of you that work in there know this very clearly, but we also have some really great data to back this up. Cortisol is a commonly used marker to investigate stress levels, and in the study I'm going to discuss, we do use cortisol as well. It can be collected a number of different ways, from blood, urine, saliva, or hair. And those kind of give you different reflection points. And we'll talk about what we used in a little bit. But this is a common marker to look at how the dog is experiencing things. One thing about cortisol, though, is it is just a measure of arousal. It doesn't tell us whether it's good arousal, like the dog knows what's going on its favorite hike, or bad arousal that it's being yelled at by a whole bunch of conspecifics. So from that, we really have to take into account the setting in which we're observing the dogs and maybe some behavior to try and get a sense of what that cortisol measure actually means. We do know that shelter dogs have elevated levels compared to owned dogs. There are a number of studies that have shown that. And looking at a study where they had owned dogs that were being kenneled in a boarding facility for the first time, which really is no different of an experience than the dog that is an owner surrender coming into our shelter, right? That they are having a loss of an attachment figure, being put in a spatially restricted setting where they might be yelled at by fellow dogs. Pretty similar, your dog being boarded doesn't know it's just being boarded temporarily. So when they were first boarded, their cortisol levels increased threefold compared to when they were at home. So I'm sure that our shelter dogs experience similar effects. There are a number of potential stressors. Again, those of you working in shelters see these every day. One is certainly excessive noise, and I think that is a ubiquitous challenge in sheltering is kennel reactivity and the noise levels in there. They often exceed 100 decibels, which is, exceeding the federally regulated limits for humans. And not only is this a problem for human hearing, but a study looked at dogs with prolonged exposure to that setting, to being in a shelter, and all of them had some permanent hearing damage. So it's an issue both on the welfare side, that this is likely a stressor, but also just on the physical side that we are having some hearing loss. And of course, that pertains to our staff and volunteers as well, and highlights the need for wearing ear protection. Of course, our dogs experience spatial confinement. Some of the shelters are housing hundreds of dogs, and so it's just impossible to give them, their whole, a full yard and be able to manage that many dogs. So they're usually experiencing some spatial confinement, which restricts their ability to engage in species-specific behaviors. For cleaning, typically they're on some sort of flooring or concrete, which might, restrict their ability to dig or things like that. So again, just some limited accessibility for our dogs. And then social isolation, that they're often kenneled alone. This is not surprising, right? A lot of these dogs come to us with unknown backgrounds, unknown dog skills. And, we're always worried about disease transmission and inner dog conflict. We also have a loss of attachment figures with owner surrender dogs, and we'll talk about that in our study as well, the impact of being a dog that is is an owner surrender. And not only do they have limited contact with other dogs, but they have limited contact with humans. Again, I think more and more the shelter work and our volunteer force and our efforts are trying to turn these things around, right? We're doing play groups and trying to take dogs on dog day out, having people come in and spend just 15 or 20 minutes with them. We know that just 15 minutes can reduce their cortisol. So I think more and more we understand the importance of these things and are making good efforts this way. And finally, the shelter is unpredictable, right? Even if they're being fed at the same time and cleaned at the same time, the rest of their day is largely unpredictable. Are they going to have somebody walk down the aisleway that yells at them, another dog? Are people going to come by and stare at them, thinking about adopting them? Are you going to have some construction going on? Are they going to be pulled out for play groups or a meet and greet or taken to the vet? So lots of things that are unpredictable and uncontrollable for them. And we know from rat lab research that unpredictable environments create sort of depressive-like symptoms. We get sort of what we call pessimism in animals. And so that's always something to think about too, is just the unpredictable nature of shelters can be a stressor for these dogs as well. So when you think about interventions to reduce stress, certainly, we're working in shelter environments where we have limited resources, right? Both financially and kind of human human resources. We rely a lot on volunteers, which is great. But even then, we don't have all the person power and all the volunteer power necessarily that we want all the time to carry out everything we'd want to. So we really have to be thoughtful and careful about the interventions we choose. Ideally, then, our interventions would be economical, both in terms of time and money, and ideally a long-lasting intervention. Some of the ones that have been evaluated so far, such as human interaction, that is by far the best studied and most effective way to improve shelter dog welfare is interact with them with humans. But we don't see a lot of long-term effects yet. When folks have looked at it across days, those effects seem to be more short-lived. However, we haven't really looked at what if we continue to give this every day, do we see a better outcome at the end? Nevertheless, some of those interventions are a little more short-term than we would like. So are there ways to provide a more long-lasting intervention? And one possibility is cohousing dogs. And so that's what we're going to focus on for the remainder of this talk. So I mentioned already that dogs housed in shelters are typically housed alone. When we see this not occurring, it's usually because the dogs have come in together as a pair and seem to do okay together, or if the shelter has space issues and they're trying to, again, save as many dogs as possible. And understandably, as I mentioned, the reason for typically housing them alone is concerns over disease transmission and injury. Nevertheless, they are a social species, and we talked about restricting their species-specific behaviors, and housing them alone also restricts that. They don't get to engage with other dogs like they normally would. Being able to engage in species-specific behaviors is a measure of welfare. So ideally, we would like to try and provide as many opportunities to engage in those species-specific behaviors as possible. And I already mentioned the restricted human interaction. So generally, our animals are lacking in both conspecific, other dogs, and heterospecific with humans interaction. So let's take a look at what we know about cohousing dogs. And a lot of this research has come from laboratory beagles, where the concerns are similar, that we're housing these dogs in fairly unenriched environments. Certainly, enrichment has come on board there too to improve their welfare. But there's still, a bit of a sterile environment for the dogs, and they're housed long term. So improving their welfare is certainly a priority. So there are a number of studies that have looked at this in the laboratory beagles. Bearda et al. Has a number of studies looking at different interventions and the effects of different things on laboratory housed beagles. She found that socially and spatially restricted dogs, so both in a smaller area and kenneled alone rather than kenneled with a partner, they saw increased coprophagy, repetitive behaviors like stereotypies, body shaking, paw lifting, which you take as a sign of potential stress, and increased aggression in males. Hetz et al. In 1992 also studied pair-housed beagles, and they kind of put them through a number of different conditions and found that when they were in the pair-housed condition, that these dogs vocalized less and manipulated the cage less and slept more. And they took all of those things to be positive outcomes for their dogs. Nevertheless, again, those beagles are purpose bred, right? They are bred to be laboratory beagles. Their parents were laboratory beagles, and so there's some selection there that might not make them our typical shelter dog. That was the life that they were born into and reared in, and that's probably very different for a lot of our dogs that were reared in a home, lived with a family. Even outside dogs might have a different experience than these beagles. So while their results are really suggestive that pair housing could be beneficial, we'd still have to investigate whether that generalizes to our very, potentially different shelter population. So there's a study from Mertens and Unshelm, who were in Germany, and they looked at shelter dogs that they put together during the day. So it's essentially like an all-day play group. And they studied this at a few different shelters. At night, the dogs were still separated, and I think this is we'll come back to this. I think it's an interesting uh, model for shelters that are maybe not comfortable leaving dogs together overnight. But with this model where the dogs were all together during the day, first off, they didn't have any injuries, and I'm not going to say that that's not going to occur here. I think the American dog population that comes into the shelters is not the same. So I wouldn't necessarily take that and say, oh, we can put all our dogs together, we won't have any injuries. I think that's very different. I think a lot of our dogs in our shelters sometimes have limited dog skills and need a lot of help to gain those. Nevertheless, the way they ran it with their population, they didn't have any injuries. They also found that the pair housed, the dogs that were put into groups were adopted on average 7 days faster. I think, we can think about what our adopters want in dogs, and it's usually a dog, hopefully a dog social dog, right? Even if they don't have a dog at home, a lot of our adopters are wanting to take their dogs out with friends who have dogs or out in public around other dogs. So even if they're not hyper social with other dogs and want to love on everybody, as long as they can kind of coexist safely with other dogs, I think that is certainly a desirable trait for a lot of our adopters. So being out in a group certainly highlights the fact that this dog can be around other dogs, and maybe that's one of the factors that increase their adoption rates. Those dogs had been there for a while, and like I said, their housing was a little different in that the dogs weren't housed together overnight. So there's another study from Grigg et al. In 2017 where they looked at dogs that were donated to a veterinary program for use in their handling labs and things like that. So this is a little, quite similar to a shelter where the dogs have been in a home and have come in to the veterinary program. Nevertheless, these dogs have been housed at the facility for at least 6 months before the start of the study, which might not be typical for a lot of our shelter dogs, where we might want to start pair housing them earlier. Nevertheless, when they looked at the effect of being pair housed, they found that there was a trend of decreased barking and pacing in the pair housed dogs, both positive behavioral outcomes. And a trend, they used hair cortisol as their measure. There's a trend of decreased hair cortisol in pair housed dogs. It didn't reach statistical significance. It's possibly that, if they had more dogs in their study and increased their statistical power, they might have found an effect. Nevertheless, they saw a trend, didn't reach significance though, but something to think about. So that's probably the study that's most similar to what we'd want to look at in our shelter dogs. Nevertheless, as I've pointed out, there's still some differences there, that a lot of those dogs had been there for at least 6 months. So it's not really capturing the dog's experience if they're both acclimating to the shelter and being put in with another dog. So in our study, we kind of more explicitly asked the question about how does single and pair housing impact shelter dogs? And, I think our results could go either way, right? We know that shelters are stressful, and these dogs are already then in a stressful environment. They're often new to the shelter. They might not have had 6 months to acclimate necessarily. So the kennel mate could act as a social buffer, right? That, oh, good, I have a friend. I feel better. I'm not alone. On the other hand, if you've had a bad roommate in the past, you could potentially expect that the kennel mate could act as an additional stressor, right? We're not now creating bigger kennels for these dogs. We're just putting in a friend, hopefully a friend, to the kennel. So now it's the same space, but now you have to navigate these social interactions with the other dog, which could be an additional stressor. So while we might think that, oh, having a buddy is going to be really useful, I think we need to recognize that it still could also be a stressor. So that's why we kind of looked at what we did. So we worked with the Humane Society of Western Montana in Missoula, Montana. It's been a great shelter to work with. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. And as we talk about our results and how they might generalize to other shelters, I'll mention again how Western Montana might be similar or different from shelters you work at. So first off, I'll tell you about the dogs. We recruited dogs that were over 6 months old, so we didn't take puppies. Western Montana doesn't have a huge stray problem. This is a private shelter. Um, so most of the dogs were recent transfers from other shelters. They do take owner surrenders there, but a lot of the dogs were recent transfers. Some from local-ish shelters. It is Montana, so local means, 2 hours away. Others were flown in. So they would get dogs from like Central Valley of California, Arizona, New Mexico, that were flown in there. We tested 66 dogs on the matchup to dog test to kind of get a read on their dog skills. So that we were selecting dogs that seemed like they might enjoy having another friend in the kennel. We did not just enroll everybody. They did have to pass this. After testing the 66 dogs, we enrolled 61. 30 were put into the single housing and 31 pair housing. And I'll mention in a moment how we divided the dogs up. As I mentioned, Western Montana is a small shelter and takes in a lot of transfers. Because of that, that was one of the reasons we could run the study there. We needed the shelter to be able to hold the dogs for 7 days while we collected our data. And Western Montana was really great agreeing to that. During that time, dogs could be adopted, but they couldn't leave. So people could come in, adopt the dog, but they were told that the dog could leave, 3 days later or whenever, and then they would come back and pick up the dog. Western Montana also had a really great enrichment program. They had dog walkers that would come in and take dogs out. They got daily enrichment in their kennels. And during cleaning time, the dogs were put outside in pens with other dogs. So they were not as deprived of dog-dog contact as potentially some other shelters. That's the way they ran things. And we'll come back to that. So we collected in-kennel behavior. So we measured 65 different behaviors. We collected 4 one-minute videos every day for 7 days on these dogs. The first one was at 8 a.m. We took it on our iPhones, standing out front of the kennel to get a sense of how does the dog respond to somebody in front of their kennel. The other 3 were taken throughout the rest of the day using a webcam over the dog's kennel, and you'll see some videos of that. So 2 of our videos, that 8 a.m. video and the next video, were when the shelter was closed. The last 2 videos, the afternoon videos, is when the shelter was open to the public. We also collected urine on the dogs and measured their urine, their cortisol creatinine ratio as a measure to get it at cortisol and their level of arousal. And as I mentioned, to enroll in the study, we tested the dogs on the matchup to dog test. For dogs that stayed more than 14 days, we tested them again on the matchup to dog test because we were interested in whether being with, co-housed with another dog would help maintain or improve their dog skills. Western Montana has a pretty high adoption rate, which is wonderful. So we didn't have a lot of dogs that stayed to day 14, but we'll talk about that. And then we also looked at length of stay, just like that Mertens and Unschelm paper. We were interested in whether being pair housed would impact how quickly dogs were adopted. We only included dogs that had been transferred into the shelter the day before their study started. So if the dog had been there for 2 days or more, they were excluded from this analysis. Mainly because at that time, we couldn't guarantee that the person that came to adopt them hadn't seen them already and seen them being single housed. We really wanted to just capture dogs where the person came in seeing that they are either pair or single housed. If you haven't done the matchup 2 dog test, this is how it proceeds. We would match the dog we were evaluating with a neutral, similarly sized dog. You walk them past each other 3 feet apart. If you don't see any signs of aggression, you can allow them to approach and interact. And if that goes well, you can allow them to interact for up to 30 seconds and then separate them. If that doesn't go well, if any part of that doesn't go well and you see some aggression, you can retest with a second dog if needed. So maybe you're worried that this dog doesn't like male dogs. You could try it with a female. So we retested 8 dogs, 3 passed with the second dog. And with those, the initial test was male, male, and we retested male, female, and that's when they passed. So 5 dogs did not pass on the second test, and that's why we tested 66 dogs and enrolled 61. So once they were enrolled, we enrolled them on day 0. So we went and collected urine before anybody went on a dog test. We collected urine on dogs that we were hoping to enroll. So we take them out in the morning between 7 and 9 a.m., walk them on a leash. We got to be pros. Maddie's Fund has happily funded a lot of our fostering research that I think Dr. Gunter is going to talk about in maybe a few weeks or a month or so, where we collect a lot of urine. We're very good at collecting urine now. So we'd collect urine. After that, we'd test them on the matchup 2 dog test. We did it in that order because we didn't want their experience on the dog test to influence the cortisol that we were measuring. We wanted that before they had their dog test. Then they were assigned a single or pair housing. And we did that semi-randomly. Because we're interested in length of stay, we know that there are a number of factors that influence adoption, and that's the size of the dog and the breed of the dog. So we did have some, we call them the California littles that were transferred in from California. We made sure that there was a pretty good balance in the single housed dogs and the pair housed dogs, the littles. We also tried to match up our hounds and our bully type dogs across both groups so that the bully type dogs weren't all in one group. They were equally distributed across both groups. After that, after they were assigned a single or pair housing, and if they were assigned a pair housing, we did a quick little intro with their potential kennel mate, made sure they seemed to get along. And part of that was based on shelter recommendations. So because they're a small shelter, the staff know their dogs pretty well. And so we're able to make recommendations on who they thought might get along pretty well together. And I know that is not true of all shelters, right? That's kind of a bonus for them to be that small. And other shelters that have a much bigger intake, that might be a little more challenging. After that, all the dogs were moved to a new kennel. And we did that again because we didn't want the pair housed dogs, any effect we saw due to pair housing being due to the fact that they moved to a new kennel with their kennel mate. And so all dogs, both single and pair housed, moved to a new kennel. After that, the next 7 days, we again collected urine in the morning, just like we did on day 0, and we collected those 4 videos that I told you about. At day 7, the dog was free to go home if it's been adopted. If the dog stayed until day 14, we retested them on the dog test. So just to show you our dog demographics, our single and pair housed, again, we got pretty good distributions between the transfer dogs, both in the single and the pair housed. Strays, not too many stray. We had 2 in single housed, 1 in pair housed. Surrender 6 and 5, and return to the shelter 5 and 2. Then the breed type, again, we tried to distribute those fairly evenly across. We had 8 bully type dogs in single housed, 6 in pair housed, 5 herding dogs in single, 3 in pair, 2 hounds in single and 5 in pair, 5 lap dogs in single housed, 7 in pair housed. We didn't get any terriers into our single house. Both of our terriers were pair housed. Working dogs, 5 in single, 4 in pair housed, and sporting, 5 in single and 5 in pair housed. So again, we're trying to distribute those different breed types in knowing that has been a factor that affects length of stay. So let's take a look at our outcomes of pair housing. And this is in fact 2 of our little cutie pies. We had 2 data collections, one in December in Montana, and the other in May. May was much nicer. December, we were out at 7 a.m. in the snow trying to collect urine. So our little friends here were wearing their jackets. As I mentioned, we had 31 dogs that were pair housed. 2 of those pairs were separated for aggression. There were no bites or injuries from that. At least one of those we know was over resources. So both of those occurred within 36 hours of being housed together. this is, again, I think, one of the points I like to make about Western Montana is that I think, relatively speaking, they're probably a well-resourced shelter in that they have a lot of active staff, and fewer dogs than a lot of the shelters I know you all work at. So they were able to kind of monitor how those pair housing groups were going and keep an eye on them. And I think if you are getting into pair housing, that is something that I would recommend, is that you monitor them to make sure things look like they're going okay. Nevertheless, I don't think that's a lot of dogs that didn't work out. That dog test seemed like, it was a pretty good selection tool. And again, they knew their dogs fairly well in terms of being able to match them up with a good kennel mate. So here are a couple of our videos. These are the ones, this one that you can see is from our webcam over the top. This is Lucy barking and sweet little Devin that's just, trying to take a snooze on his bed. These were two of our other pair house dogs. This is from one of our 8 a.m. videos where we are standing out front. Western Montana did have 3 different kennel sizes. So if there were 2 big dogs, we did make sure that they're in a slightly bigger kennel. If they were pair housed small dogs, they were kept in the same size, sort of smaller kennel. So let's take a look at the significant behavioral differences we found. The first one is gazing. So we measured how long they would gaze at us. We only measured that from the 8 a.m. videos because that's really the only time we could detect whether they were gazing at us or not. So this is the mean number of intervals per 1-minute video. So our videos were 1 minute long. We broke them up into 12 5-second intervals and coded each interval were they gazing at us. We saw that the single house dogs in this open bar gazed at us significantly longer than the pair house dogs during that 8 a.m. video. We don't know exactly why, but one of our thoughts is that because they had a kennel mate, they had other things going on, that us in front of their kennel was not the only game in town, and they had another friend in their kennel they could be interacting with. Coming down here, again, the mean number of intervals per 1-minute video. This was collected from all of our videos. The first is lip licking. We saw significantly more instances of lip licking in our single housed dogs than our pair housed. Same for standing on kennel. So that's 2 paws up on the kennel. Significantly more intervals with ears back in our single housed dogs. Significantly more whining in our single housed dogs, and more single object play with our single housed dogs. So just taking lip licking, ears back, and whining, these are all behaviors that in the literature have been associated with stress. And so it suggests that our single house dogs were experiencing more stress, at least they were showing that behaviorally, than our pair house dogs. There might be, a reduction in stress-related behaviors when they're pair housed. The same on the standing on kennel. And what's interesting is that some of the big dogs that were in those end kennels, they actually had 2 windows, one into their aisleway and one into, they were in sort of 4 pods of 4 rooms of different pods, one looking out to the main aisleway. So they actually had more opportunity to stand, and probably, I think, more motivation to stand, right? There's more things to look at, but we actually saw more standing on kennel in the single house dogs. And again, I wonder if that goes back to the fact that they are alone and kind of, seeking out more interaction from other beings, whether it's another dog or a human. And then single object play, we saw more of that in the single house dogs. We also coded dog play and pair object play. So dogs that were playing with an object together. So I think the effect of this that we're seeing that single house dogs showed more single object play is because the pair house dogs had other ways of playing that they could engage in dog-dog play or pair object play, not just single object play. So again, this suggests, though, that we see a reduction in stress-related behaviors with our pair-housed dogs. Just looking at some behaviors that we could only measure in our pair-housed dogs, two of them that we're interested in were contact and proximity. This is their physical contact, so meaning that at least one body part was in contact with the other animal, and that excludes play or aggression. So they had to just be kind of standing there or laying there. This is actually two dogs from our study. There are two beds in this enclosure, but they regularly chose to sleep on the same bed together, which was really adorable. So again, mean number of intervals per 1 minute video, we're seeing, around two intervals per 1 minute video. So about 16% of the time, they might be in physical contact. So it's a fairly high, I think high percentage of time that they're in physical contact. And proximity was even higher, that in nearly 75% of the intervals we saw them in proximity to one another. Of course, the shelter, kennels can be small, but for the most part, these dogs could certainly choose to be further away than that if they wanted to. And I didn't tell you the definition of proximity, which was at least within one dog's length of each other. So if they're further away than one dog's length of their dog length, then it was considered not in proximity. So I think both of these speak to kind of the social behavior of these dogs, that they are choosing to be in physical contact with one another and in proximity to one another. Just some other behaviors that might be of interest. These were not statistically significantly different between single and pair housed dogs. But just to run through them, we saw dogs sort of equally distributed with whether they're in the front or the back of the kennel, lying down about 50% of the time, sitting a little bit less, and the rest were standing. We looked at head up and head down, both during lying down. Dr. Gunter's dissertation suggests that if they have their head down, they might be in a more relaxed state than the head up, where they might still be more vigilant. Our dogs were facing forward in most of the intervals we coded, and some facing away, some wagging tail. When you look at their locomotion and enclosure contact, moving away, jumping on the kennel, leaning on the door or the wall, and sniffing were all pretty low. The one that was high, though, almost 50%, was on the bed. And I know it's sort of standard now to provide beds for dogs, but I think this just highlights how much they use their bed, that 50% of the intervals that we coded, they were on the bed at some point during that interval. And then some vocalization, grooming, and maintenance, relatively low barking, which was, great. Low licking self, shaking off, yawning, and some panting. So just to show you the cuties on the bed, here's a pair housed group. And I just think it's so cute the way they snooze there together. They are on the elevated coranda bed. There's another bed in there. So they only had one elevated coranda bed. Those big dogs I showed you earlier had two elevated corandas, and they still chose to sleep together. And then this is our friend Jesse, who's just hanging out on his bed. So again, putting beds in is certainly a good thing for these doggos. So some takeaways from that: we do see a reduction in stress-related behaviors when dogs are pair housed. We saw a higher percentage of intervals in which pair housed dogs were in contact or proximity, again, I think suggesting that they are choosing to be near each other. They're not trying to avoid each other, and a lot of bed use to make sure they have beds. So let's look at our cortisol. First off, we looked at our intake effects. So we put a number of different things in the model: the sex of the dog, the age of the dog, their intake type, and how they were housed, single or pair housed. One of the significant differences was for day 0, this is their baseline data. And sorry, in this analysis, we did not put in single or pair housed. We just looked at sex of the dog, age of the dog, weight of the dog, and their intake type. The one thing that popped out as being significant was intake type. We found that owner surrender dogs had significantly higher levels of a higher ratio of cortisol creatinine to transfer dogs. This lines up with prior research by Hibby et al. In 2006 that also found that owner surrender dogs seem to have a higher cortisol level than dogs that came in other ways. And this might be due to the loss of the attachment figure, that if they've just been in a home and they've been interacting with this person who's a source of reinforcement for them and now they're gone, it might be even more stressful than for some of these other dogs. Although that doesn't explain necessarily why our returns are lower, but it's possible that since they've been in the shelter once before, that maybe coming back is not as stress-inducing potentially as for our straight owner surrender dogs. The other interesting thing, though, is that our transfer dogs were so low. There's a lot of research, not a lot, but some good good research that demonstrates that transport is stressful for dogs, right? Not surprisingly, even 45-minute car rides can increase their cortisol. So we know that transfer can be stressful for dogs. A lot of our dogs were transferred in by airplane. The shelter would go out the day or two before our study started and collect about 20 or so dogs off of a plane. And so I do wonder if this low this group being the lowest of all is maybe a reflection of that maybe they were very stressed during transport, and getting back on solid ground and out of the plane, they actually see kind of an overcorrection of really low cortisol after that. So now let's take a look at the effect of single or pair housing. What we did for this analysis is we took their cortisol creatinine ratio on days 1 through 7 and subtracted day 0 from it. So day 0 is really their baseline. That was before they were moved to a new kennel and before they were put potentially in with another kennel mate if they were in the pair housing group. So this is the difference between day 1 and day 0, day 2 and day 0, day 3 and day 0. So a positive, this is our 0 line, meaning no difference. Above this means that they had slightly higher cortisol creatinine than they did on day 0. And the first thing to point out is that both groups did have not a lot, but slightly higher than 0 cortisol creatinine on day 1, suggesting, I think, that maybe moving to that new kennel could be a stressor. I think that's something for us to play around with in the future, is what is the impact on our dogs when they move kennels? Are we kind of resetting them and engaging their stress response again if they have to move to a new kennel? And does that change how we move dogs through our shelter? This is the only day where both groups were positive, a higher cortisol creatinine than day 0. After that, we saw a reduction in that their cortisol creatinine was lower than on day 0. And that tracks with a lot of the other research that we see as dogs sort of acclimate typically to the shelter, that most of them show a decrease in their cortisol levels. Nevertheless, we saw a bigger reduction in our pair housed dogs. We did see a significant difference here where the pair housed dogs had significantly lower cortisol levels than our single house dogs. Nevertheless, it's a relatively small effect. These differences in cortisol are not huge. So this is not going to, override all of the other stressors the dog is experiencing, but it does suggest maybe there is sort of a buffering effect of a well-matched kennel mate. This is similar to Grigg et al. They used the hair cortisol or fur cortisol as their measure. They also saw a trend like this. Theirs didn't reach statistical significance. It was a relatively small effect. So it's pretty similar to what we saw as well. And as I mentioned already, day 1 was the only day where that was positive above 0 for both groups. We can see that on day 7 that our single house dogs are above 0 again, whereas our pair house dogs are much lower. So from this, we can see the intake type can affect cortisol levels. The owner surrender dogs show the highest levels. And I think, as we think about how we manage our dogs coming into our shelter, Maybe that means that dogs that are owner surrenders maybe need a little more input as they come in because maybe that loss of attachment figure is particularly hard on them. Maybe they need more human interaction, maybe a little more enrichment as they settle in. So we can think about what strategies could we use to help those dogs transition to shelter care. The transport, I think, is still an interesting question and needs more research to see why our transport dogs were so low. And I think if I remember correctly, most of the studies that have looked at transport have kind of looked at the immediate effect of transport, but not like the next day or two to see if maybe we see an overcorrection. And the pair housing had a significant but small effect on cortisol levels. And that lines up with our behavioral data suggesting that pair housing could be a bit of a social buffer for our dogs. And like I said, it's a small effect. There's so many other stressors in shelters that we're not going to see huge effects. We did see good effects in our fostering study, the dogs being sent out on sleepovers or week-long. Even then, the effect of that is smaller than shelter differences that we saw between cortisol levels. Again, indicating that there's so much more we can do to help our dogs improve their time in our shelters. Nevertheless, I think the more we kind of find these interventions that will work in your shelter and maybe combine them, we're going to improve the dog's experience for sure. So finally, let's take a look at length of stay. We put in a number of factors into our model: weight, housing type, whether they're single or pair housed, intake type, and sex of the dog. What predicted length of stay? Two things popped out. One was weight, which we have seen in prior research that bigger dogs take longer to be adopted. But housing type, whether it's single or pair housed, also predicted length of stay. So for every 10-pound increase, the average increase in their average length of stay increased by 1 day. So the bigger the dog, longer length of stay. Not a surprise, right? Unfortunately. Our pair house dogs had a shorter length of stay by 4 days. That's pretty substantial, I think. That's even at a place like Western Montana, where their dogs get adopted pretty quickly. 4 days moving the dog out faster than that is really, I think, substantial, both for the dog and for the kennel staff. I put this together because there was an interested in big dogs and how cohousing affected them. So this is the same data, and we didn't include this in our paper, but we did pull it out just to look at this. So we know that big dogs have longer lengths of stay. This is the dog's weight in pounds across the x-axis and their length of stay on the y-axis. Pair housed dogs are in white, and the single housed dogs are in black. This line represents the kind of trend line for our single housed dogs, and the broken line is the trend line for our pair housed dogs. What you can see again is that whether you're single or pair housed, if you are bigger, your length of stay increases. What I think is really interesting, though, is that for our pair housed dogs, even for our big dogs, that gets tamped down. So the pair housing effect we saw was not just for small dogs. Being pair housed as a big dog can also help reduce their length of stay. So our takeaways from this is that pair housing dogs might increase their likelihood of adoption. I think that's really, really exciting because we know that the best way to serve our dogs is to move them out of the shelter, whether that's through fostering or adoption. This parallels work with cats. Some research in cats that also found that cats that were in community rooms were typically adopted more quickly than cats that were housed in individual kennels. The reason for this, we didn't investigate, but we can hypothesize on this. I think it clearly demonstrates their dog-dog skills, right? You come in and you see them living and hopefully living happily with another dog. It hopefully highlights something that is important to our adopters, that they can be around other dogs safely. I recognize that pair housing is not for every shelter. And so if you are not in the position where you can pair house dogs, if we think that being seen to have good dog skills is important for getting the dog adopted, then I think about what other ways can we highlight good dog skills? Can we put them into, small play groups, just even with another dog, and take videos of that we can post online? Um, can we have that video playing in our entryway, our foyer at the shelter? Can we have it playing near the dog's kennel? So again, we might have to get creative at ways we can demonstrate dog skills with our dogs if pair housing is not an option. So our overall takeaways: pair housing can improve shelter dog welfare, both their proximal welfare, meaning their experience while in the shelter. We saw fewer stress-related behaviors and a reduction in cortisol, but also their distal, that they get adopted more quickly than single house dogs. I mentioned earlier on that Western Montana had a pretty robust enrichment program already, and the dogs did get out in the morning during cleaning time to interact with other dogs. So it's possible that shelters that don't have that don't have the resources for as robust an enrichment program, or don't put their dogs together during cleaning. We might see even bigger effects there. So that would be really interesting to evaluate how well these results generalize to other shelters, and maybe we see even bigger effects. Nevertheless, I always want to highlight that this has to be done carefully. I think the concern over disease transmission and injury, are not for nothing, right? That we know those are concerns, and so we have to make sure that we feel confident with our healthcare plan for our dogs. If you're transferring in dogs, that you're feeling confident in your transfer partners, that you're getting healthy dogs. So I think that has to be done carefully. And of course, on the dog side, I think that's particularly of interest for us, and we'll talk about a few considerations here. First off, as I mentioned, we had, I think, well-matched dogs. We didn't just randomly throw two dogs together and hope for the best. We made sure that first that they both seemed like they had some sociable tendencies from the dog test that we did. Then we actually put those dogs together and monitored them. We did a dog introduction, let them engage before we put them in a kennel together. And then we continued to monitor them. And as I mentioned, the staff at Western Montana knew their dogs fairly well, and so could help us create successful matches. So if that's not the case for your shelter, then either thinking about other ways you can get there, or again, pair housing doesn't have to be for everyone. So I think that's true of all the interventions we talk about, that we see some good effects in a variety of interventions. Some will work for your shelter, some won't. I think monitoring, again, is important. We saw issues arise, if we're going to have issues arise within that first 36 hours. So certainly monitoring, pretty densely during the first few days that they're together is essential. We studied pair house dogs, two dogs in a kennel. I suspect there are limits to these benefits, that crowding in 4 to 6 more dogs in here, we might, save them from euthanasia, right? That we're able to not make euthanasia decisions based on space. But if we're thinking about the welfare of the animals, I suspect that's quite a bit of a stressor. You can imagine being in a small kennel and having one roommate. Think about having 5 to 6 or 7 other roommates. That's a lot of social navigation to work through, and not all of the dogs, I suspect, are going to have great dog skills. Again, I recognize that some of these big municipal shelters that are trying to save as many dogs as possible and have just a flood of dogs coming in, that's what they end up having to do. But I think it's something that we ought to be cautious about and move away from, probably, if we can, unless we have just really big kennels we can put the dogs in, and we're able to assess the dogs, make sure everybody gets along really well. We had our Malinois. We started fostering a dog last year after our shepherd passed away. Then we just got a new shepherd puppy. We just have 3 dogs in a home, and I'm trying to navigate, right? Like, manage everybody's feelings and needs socially. And I just can't imagine putting these 3 who do get along well together, but of course, they can get on each other's nerves in a small kennel and hope for the best. I think that asks a lot of the dogs. So our data really just speak to pair housing, and I think there are some limits to the benefits. If we get up to really crowded kennels, we're not going to see the benefits so much. So with that, I want to thank Humane Society of Western Montana, of course, our funders, the Waltham Foundation, without which this project isn't possible, my wonderful collaborators and some assistants that helped with coding. Grace Hecker was one of my students. She's the first author on the paper. She did a lot of writing, and she coded all like 1,600 videos by herself. She said she never wants to code another video again. Understandable. So I know I've run a little longer than I expected, but I'm happy to take questions, and I'll also tune into the forum to answer any other questions I don't get to here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feuerbacher. This was super, super interesting and exciting research results. Before we get to questions, before we started this webcast, you were talking a little bit about the online master's program that you have, and I think some of our audience might be interested. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yes, we have an online master's program here at Virginia Tech. It is designed for behavior professionals, so it's a very flexible program. Really centers around learning more about learning theory, applications, ethology, cognition. It's all animal related. We have some wonderful professors. I am the coordinator for it, but Dr. Gunter is here at Virginia Tech full time and helps me with the program. And then we have like Dr. Spalding and Dr. Heckman, Dr. Mindy Waite, Dr. Robin Foster. I collect lots of fun, good people to teach here. So we are always looking for wonderful shelter folks to join us. The shelter people that come in, we've had a great time with, just because you're already so knowledgeable and so passionate.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. We have a lot of questions and not much time, so we'll see how much we can get to, and the rest will be answered on Maddie's Pet Forum. First, did you factor in gender and spay-neuter status? Wondered if intact dogs, even same gender, were housed together and if they got along okay.
Almost all of the dogs were altered, so we didn't really run into that. I think we might have had one intact female. She was put in with a neutered male. So we didn't get into that. That would certainly be an interesting question to investigate.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, were the dogs who were transferred in medicated during or prior to transport for sedation or stress?
No, they weren't. I know that's probably best practices these days, but these dogs were not.
Okay, thank you. Next is, did the small dogs have their own beds? And you talked about this a little bit, or were they meant to share the cot?
They did have their own beds, although, as I mentioned, there was only one for the small dogs, only one Kuranda bed would fit in there, really. So it was Kuranda bed and, kind of, a little dog bed on the floor. So for them, it's understandable why they might dogpile onto the Kuranda bed, but those big dogs did have two beds and still chose to sleep together.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how or were feeding times managed to avoid issues in the paired dogs?
Yeah, so they would take a dog out and feed separately. So yeah, that's a great question. I didn't mention that. They were not fed together in the kennel, and I know that is going to be a challenge for some shelters, right? That don't have the time or the resources to necessarily separate dogs. These kennels did not have a guillotine door on them. They were just one-sided. So I think if you had a guillotine door and were able to separate them and feed on opposite sides, that could make it pretty easy.
Okay, thank you. Another question just related to logistics and considerations for other shelters. The kennels in your study were quite spacious compared to many shelters. What are your thoughts about the potential impact of differences from your findings versus a shelter that doesn't have that much room?
Yeah, these I think actually were pretty small because they were one-sided. So what you saw in the video was all that you got. I know Allison is linked to the paper in there, and you can see the exact specifications. The big dog kennels were probably twice the size. The ones that we put the pair house dogs into were probably twice the size of the single housed. I don't think actually, if you think of most kennels that are indoor outdoor or have two sides, I don't think they're really actually that much different. I do think size probably matters, right? That the more kind of squished together you are, and you have less opportunity to navigate around each other, avoid each other if you want to. That could be challenging. But the kennel dimensions are in that paper, so you can take a look and see how that relates to the shelter you're at.
All right, thank you. Last question that we're going to have time for. Were any pair house dogs adopted together, or did you notice any changes to multi-animal adoptions noted during this trial?
None of the pair house dogs were adopted together. I think that would have been adorable if they had been, but they were all adopted to separate homes. I we didn't, that's a great question. We did not track who adopted them and whether they were being adopted into a home that already had a resident dog or not. Yeah, excellent question. I
All right,
can't answer it, but maybe next time.
wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Feuerbacher.
Thanks for having me. It's so fun, and I will check in on the online forum.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to all of you for watching today's webcast. As just mentioned, Dr. Feuerbacher will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion and answer questions that we didn't have time for today. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.